the most haunted prisons in the world. The sound of rattling chains echoed through the empty halls, but no one was there to make them move. Somewhere deep in the darkness, something was waiting, watching, listening. But what was it? And why did it feel like it was getting closer to you? The old prison loomed in the distance, its jagged silhouette barely visible under the flickering moonlight. It was as if the earth itself had rejected it, casting it out into the wilderness as an unwanted relic of a dark past. No one had been inside for decades, and no one ever should. Yet James, driven by a curiosity he couldn't quite control, found himself standing at its rusted gates. His heartbeat quickened, the rhythm echoing in his chest like a prisoner within a cage. He wasn't sure what pulled him closer, but the moment his foot crossed the threshold, a cold shiver ran down his spine. He felt it. Something had noticed him, something ancient, something alive. The air inside was stifling. Each breath felt like he was inhaling the dust and sorrow of 100 years. The air was thick with the stench of rot, mildew, mold, and the unmistakable scent of decay. But there was something deeper, something unspeakable that clung to the stone like a wound that had never healed. The smell wasn't just from the building's decay. It was the smell of forgotten souls, trapped in the walls, their suffering lingering, festering. James stepped further into the prison, his boots scraping against the cracked concrete floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the building itself was growing impatient, unwilling to let him leave. The prison had always been notorious for its brutal conditions, but that was nothing compared to what he felt now. The darkness wasn't just a lack of light, it was a presence, something thick and oppressive, wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. It followed him, even when he tried to turn back. The hallway stretched on, the dim light from his flashlight casting eerie shadows along the peeling walls. Every corner he turned seemed to close in on him, each turn feeling more claustrophobic than the last. And the walls, they weren't just walls, they were breathing, or at least, that's what it felt like. He could hear the faintest creak, a subtle shifting of weight, as if the building was adjusting itself to his movements. He had seen abandoned places before, buildings left to rot. They had their own eerie stillness, but nothing compared to this. This was alive. Every sound he made, every footfall echoed through the corridors like a scream, and each time he moved, the air seemed to tighten around him, as if the prison were trying to consume him whole. As he ventured deeper, a sharp, sudden noise broke the silence, the sound of chains dragging across the floor, followed by a metallic screech, like a heavy door slowly grinding open. His heart jumped and he froze. His flashlight flickered, the beam shuddering as if afraid to expose the truth in front of him. He waited, the sound of his own ragged breathing almost deafening in the silence. But the noise stopped, just as abruptly as it had started. His hand, trembling, reached for his phone, but when he checked the screen, it was blank. No signal, no way to contact the outside world. It's just the wind, he told himself, trying to convince his own mind. But he knew better. The hairs on his neck stood on end, a primal instinct telling him he wasn't alone. The shadows were moving, twitching, shifting in ways that couldn't be explained by the faint light of his flashlight. There was something in the air, something wrong, like the very space around him had been tainted. A whisper brushed against his ear, so faint he wasn't sure if it was real or if it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But it felt too deliberate, too purposeful. "Get out," it whispered. The voice was a hoarse rasp, like nails scraping across a chalkboard. James jerked back, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it would burst from his chest. He spun around, desperate to catch sight of whoever had spoken, but the hallway remained empty. Empty except for the shadows that seemed to grow darker, thicker, more alive with each passing second. There was no escape. No matter how hard he looked, there was nothing but the oppressive blackness that surrounded him. The walls seemed to close in, the very space shrinking, suffocating him until the air itself felt heavy, impossible to breathe. His throat tightened, a primal terror bubbling up from deep within. This wasn't just an old abandoned prison. This was a place alive with something else, something far worse than mere bricks and mortar. And then it hit him, what he was truly feeling. He was being watched. He could sense eyes on him, eyes that were unseen but still present, suffocatingly close. His thoughts raced, trying to rationalize the unexplainable. The whispers grew louder, growing in volume, forming sentences that clawed at the edges of his sanity. "We were here before you. You are nothing but a visitor, a guest." He could feel the presence of something ancient, something that had been there long before the prison had even been built. Something that had always been a part of this place, a malignant force, and it had been waiting for him. A sudden gust of wind, no, a breath, pushed past him, carrying with it a smell so foul, so nauseating, that James gagged. It wasn't just the smell of death. It was the smell of decay, of rot, that had settled into the bones of the prison itself. His legs felt weak beneath him as the floor beneath him seemed to sink, groan under his weight. The entire building creaked and groaned as if it were alive, shifting beneath his feet. The longer he stood there, frozen with fear, the more the shadows seemed to close in around him. The walls, once solid and immovable, now seemed to move, ever so slightly. James felt a deep, primal fear crawl up his spine, realizing that the prison was changing, adjusting to his presence, accommodating him. He wasn't just a trespasser, he was being absorbed into its history, into its darkness. And just when he thought he might lose his mind, when his sanity seemed to be hanging by a thread, he heard it again. The rattling of chains. Only this time it was closer, much closer. The darkness around him seemed to shift, the shadows swirling like smoke. They were coming for him, and there was no way out. James spun around again, heart hammering, sweat dripping down his face. He reached for the door behind him just a few steps away, but as his hand touched the cold metal, the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The sound of 1,000 souls, screaming, crying, pleading, filled his ears. And in that instant, James knew the truth. The prison wasn't abandoned. It had never been abandoned. It was alive, and it would never let him go. James's body was frozen in place, a tense knot of dread binding him to the spot where he stood. The whispers had begun again, this time more insistent, louder. They echoed from every direction, swirling around him like invisible serpents, curling around his limbs, squeezing the air from his lungs. The walls, once solid and unyielding, had taken on a life of their own. The bricks seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if breathing with him. The prison had never truly been abandoned. It had been waiting for someone like him to walk in. Someone who didn't understand the weight of its history or the dark things that lingered in its shadows. He tried to move, but the moment he took a step, the air grew heavier, colder. A gust of wind, unnatural in its speed and intensity, slammed into his chest. It wasn't the normal chill of a draft. It was a suffocating cold, sharp and biting, as if the temperature itself had been dragged down by the very souls trapped within these walls. The whispers continued, crawling under his skin, digging into his thoughts like worms. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was low, guttural, like the groan of a man buried alive beneath the earth. The words felt wrong, as though they weren't meant for him, but for someone who had been here long before him. The darkness around him pressed in closer, its oppressive weight clinging to every inch of space. He could feel the walls bending toward him, their unseen fingers reaching out, trying to pull him in, to absorb him. The light from his flashlight flickered as he moved it through the corridor, the beam dancing frantically across the decaying walls. But no matter how far he looked, no matter where he aimed the light, the shadows refused to retreat. They weren't just in front of him, they were in the very air he breathed. The prison seemed to live in the shadows, to thrive within them. And it wanted him to feel every inch of that suffocating darkness. James's legs trembled beneath him, the fear of being watched intensifying with every passing second. His mind raced as he tried to rationalize what was happening, but nothing made sense. The whispers weren't just voices, they were a presence, an oppressive force that seemed to tear at the fabric of his sanity. The words echoed in his skull, louder now, demanding his attention. "You can't leave." His breathing quickened, his chest tightening with panic. He could hear the rasp of his own breath in the suffocating silence, louder than the whispers now, drowning out the reality of his situation. He wasn't just in an old prison. He was trapped in something far older, something much more sinister. The walls began to close in, subtly at first, almost imperceptibly. But James noticed. He could feel the space narrowing around him, his skin prickling as though the walls were drawing near, eager to crush him in their cold embrace. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, each thud louder than the last. The rustling whispers of the forgotten souls seemed to grow in volume, no longer just a murmur but a cacophony of voices all speaking at once. "We were here before you. We are still here. We were never alone." His stomach twisted, nausea rising within him. The floor beneath him felt wrong, as though it had been altered by the weight of too many footsteps, too many tortured souls. The tiles beneath his boots were slick with something darker than water, something alive. His pulse quickened as he looked down, and there in the flickering light he saw it. Red stains, dark and thick, seeping from the cracks in the floor, spreading out like veins, intertwining with the walls as though the building itself had been wounded. The prison had absorbed every scream, every drop of blood, every moment of suffering, and now it was feeding on him. James's mind reeled. He stumbled back, his hands fumbling for the flashlight as if it would protect him from what was happening, from the growing terror that crawled under his skin. But the more he moved, the more the prison seemed to move with him, adapting, shifting. He wasn't just in a place, he was in its space, its world. And that world was made of pain. Every sound he made echoed back to him, amplified, distorted. The walls absorbed every footstep, every breath, every heartbeat. And in return, they gave nothing but silence, except for the whispers. "Why are you still here?" they asked. "Do you not know your place?" The whispers weren't just around him now. They were inside him. They seemed to crawl into his mind, tugging at his thoughts, drowning out everything else. He tried to scream, but the sound was lost before it could escape his throat. He felt the weight of the prison pressing in, its cold, unyielding fingers squeezing around his chest. The air felt thick with something otherworldly, something ancient, and with it came a realization so terrible, so unbearable, that it froze him in his tracks. The walls weren't just made of stone, they were made of souls, trapped souls. He staggered back, his breath shallow, gasping for air that refused to fill his lungs. The walls seemed to pulse with life, their dark veins running deep into the heart of the prison, each one pumping with the energy of the souls that had been consumed. The air was thick with their pain, their anger, their frustration, and their fear. The whispers were the echoes of those who had never left, those who had been trapped here for eternity, their souls bound to the prison, their suffering embedded into the very foundation of the place. The floor beneath him groaned. It wasn't a sound of settling stone, but of something alive, something that had been awakened by his presence. He turned, eyes wild, heart racing, desperate to escape. But there was no escape. There was no way out. The prison had always been here, always existed, and always would. And now it wanted him. It needed him. A sound, a low hiss, came from behind him. He whirled around, but the hallway remained empty except for the oppressive darkness that continued to press against him, suffocating him, smothering him in its weight. He could hear the sound of chains dragging across the floor again, but this time it was closer. The sound of something dragging itself, crawling toward him. But there was no body, no form to the sound. Only the faint clinking of metal, like shackles on a broken soul, growing louder until it was deafening. And then, nothing. Silence. But the silence was worse than the noise, because in the silence he could feel it. It was close. Something was near, watching, waiting. A scream clawed at the back of his throat, but it was swallowed by the suffocating darkness. The whispers surged in his mind again, more frantic, more desperate. "You are part of us now. You can never leave. You belong to the prison." And in that instant, James understood. The prison was not just a place. It was a sentience, a hunger, a force that had consumed the souls of countless others before him, and now it was coming for him. It was never going to let him leave. James could feel the walls closing in, but not with the usual weight of stone and mortar. This was different. This was a living thing, a malevolent force that wrapped around him, squeezing the very air from his lungs, suffocating him with a presence he couldn't see, only feel. It was as though the prison itself had become an extension of some dark consciousness, one that could sense his every thought, every breath. The sounds of his steps reverberated in the emptiness, a constant reminder that he was not alone. The prison wasn't just old, abandoned, or decaying. It was alive, pulsing with a horrific energy that hummed beneath the surface of reality. Every step he took down the corridor was like sinking deeper into a nightmare. The floor groaned beneath him, the sound like a low, guttural moan of pain. It wasn't the sound of stone settling under the weight of time. It was the sound of something being forced down, something struggling to remain hidden beneath the layers of the prison's history. The dim light of his flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into utter darkness. The silence was worse than the whispers, worse than the weight of the prison pressing in on him. The silence was alive. He could feel it, hear it even in the absence of sound. It was as if the walls were listening to him, waiting for him to make the first mistake. In the blackness, his breathing grew shallow, uneven, as his mind struggled to hold on to any semblance of reason. There were no windows here, no escape. The only thing left was the suffocating confinement of the walls and the relentless darkness that surrounded him. He reached out, fingers brushing against the rough surface of the wall, feeling the coldness seep into his skin, a cold that was unlike any he had ever known. It was ancient, primal, a chill that seemed to come from a place far older than the building itself, as if it had been waiting for someone like him to wander into its grasp. The walls were no longer just stone. They had become something other, something alive. Suddenly there was a noise, a sound too faint to identify at first, but unmistakable when it came again. A whisper, low and raspy, curling in the darkness. "We know you're here." It wasn't a voice. Not really. It was more like a sensation, a presence pressing against his mind, seeping into his thoughts, touching places he didn't know existed. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he thought he heard footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate, as though someone was pacing just out of sight. He spun around, flashlight shaking in his hand, but there was nothing there. Just the walls, the endless corridor stretching into the unknown. The fear began to claw at him, digging deep into his gut. He was alone, but he wasn't, and that thought sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He continued forward, though every instinct screamed at him to turn back. The air felt wrong, heavy with a palpable sense of dread. It wasn't just the eerie stillness or the whispering voices that grew louder the farther he walked. It was something else, a suffocating weight, like the building itself was closing in around him. He could feel the temperature drop as he walked deeper into the prison, the chill biting at his skin, seeping into his bones. The prison was ancient, but it wasn't the age that made it feel alive. It was the souls that had been trapped here, souls that had been forgotten, souls that were angry. He didn't know how long he'd been walking or how far he'd gone, but it felt like hours. He reached a door, rusted and bent from years of neglect. The hinges creaked as he pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Inside, the air was thick with a foul, musty stench, like the breath of something that had been sealed away for centuries. The room was smaller than the corridor, its walls covered in peeling paint and grime. There were old, rusted bars on the windows, but no light came through, just more darkness. As James stepped inside, the temperature seemed to plummet even further. His breath clouded in front of him, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He felt something watching him, something invisible yet undeniably there. He turned to his left, and that's when he saw them. The cells, forgotten, abandoned, but still waiting. Each cell was smaller than he expected, just a metal cot and a toilet, but each one felt like it was holding something more, something alive. He could feel the presence of every soul that had ever been confined to these tiny rooms, their pain, their terror, still lingering in the air like a rotten stench that would never fade. The silence in the room was overwhelming, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. The whispers began again, louder now, more insistent. They were coming from inside the cells, swirling around him like insects. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was distorted, like the sound of 1,000 different voices speaking at once. James staggered back, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of the madness around him. But there was no sense. There was only this, the oppressive, suffocating air, the sense that he was being watched by eyes he couldn't see. The walls pressed in even tighter, the very foundation of the prison groaning in protest. One of the cells creaked. James froze, his body rigid with terror. Slowly, with a groan of old hinges, the door to the cell on the far right opened. There was no one there, nothing visible, but the space inside seemed different. It was darker, more suffocating. He could feel the temperature drop even further, the air growing thick and cold as he stared at the empty cell. But the longer he looked, the more it felt like someone was standing there, just out of sight, just beyond the reach of the light. He stepped closer, unwillingly drawn to it, as though the cell were calling to him. The whispers grew louder, their words more frantic now. "Let us out, let us out." James reached for the bars, his hand trembling as he touched them. The metal was ice cold, far colder than it should have been. He could feel it in his bones. Something was wrong. He couldn't explain it, but the sensation was too strong to ignore. He had to get out. He had to leave. But his legs felt heavy, sluggish, as though they were no longer obeying his commands. He stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his vision blurring as the shadows around him deepened. And then, the voice that had been whispering in the back of his mind, now screaming, "You will never leave." James spun around, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around him. But the darkness was too thick, too oppressive, and the walls were closing in. The cold was unbearable now, pressing on him from all sides, like 1,000 icy hands reaching for him. His chest tightened as he gasped for breath, but the air refused to fill his lungs. There was no escape. He was trapped. The whispers had grown into a deafening roar now, a cacophony of tortured souls, all begging for release. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow, a figure, shifting in the darkness, just for a moment, but it was enough. The figure was tall, slender, and unnaturally thin, its body contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its face was a blank, featureless void, but James could feel its eyes, staring at him, watching, waiting. It wasn't just the prison that was alive. It was everything in it. The souls, the darkness, the walls, the watchers. And now, they were waiting for him to join them, to become one of them. Every footstep James took felt like a thundering crash in the silence that clung to the halls of the prison. A violent clash against the void that had swallowed the rest of the world. His heart pounded in his chest, but it wasn't just his own pulse that rang in his ears. It was the echo of something else, something older, something angrier. The darkness around him had become an unrelenting pressure, almost as if it were trying to claw its way into his mind, pulling him deeper into a labyrinth of whispers and half-formed thoughts. He could hear the walls breathing, exhaling something foul that made his skin crawl and his stomach churn. The air smelled like rot, but it wasn't the decaying stone or the abandoned decay of this forsaken place. No, it was something far worse. A stench of suffering, of bodies left to die in darkness, of souls trapped in an endless cycle of torment. James tried to steady his breath, trying to remind himself that he had come this far, that he couldn't afford to turn back now. He'd spent hours, perhaps days, wandering through this forsaken place, and yet it felt as though time itself had unraveled. The very essence of the prison seemed to stretch and distort, bending the perception of reality. Each corridor looked the same, the cracked stone walls standing like tombstones in a graveyard of the forgotten. The halls narrowed with every step, drawing him deeper into their grasp. The light from his flashlight was dimming now, flickering violently, as if it were reluctant to reveal the horrors lurking just beyond the edge of vision. The temperature had plummeted, dropping so low that his breath misted in the air like a thick fog, a cloud that choked him with its frozen grip. He could feel the cold seeping into his very bones, an icy crawl creeping up his spine. It wasn't just the chill of a forgotten building, it was something alive, something that fed on fear. The air tasted like metal, but it wasn't the tang of rust or decay. It was a taste that clung to his tongue, something wrong, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. Every breath he took felt as though he were inhaling the very essence of the prison. Its darkness, its death, its eternal unyielding hunger. A low hum vibrated beneath the stone floor, a rhythmic pulsing sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It resonated through James's skull, a sickening throb that made him dizzy. It was like the prison itself was alive, pulsing, breathing, watching him. The whispers that had followed him in the shadows now felt like they were closing in on him, pushing against the walls of his mind, filling the empty space with their desperate cries. "Join us," they moaned, in voices that sounded both human and inhuman, their tones warped by time and pain. James didn't know if he could trust his own thoughts anymore, if they were his thoughts, or if the prison itself was feeding them to him, twisting his perceptions into something unrecognizable. Suddenly, the walls shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight tremor, a minor shift in the structure, but James felt it deep in his gut. A lurching sensation like the very foundation of the building was being pulled from beneath him. He staggered, his hand clutching at the nearest wall for support, but it was as though the stone itself was moving, expanding, contracting like a living organism. The feeling of isolation, of being completely and utterly alone in this suffocating, malevolent place, was unbearable. He tried to call out, but the words caught in his throat, choked off by the growing weight of something unseen, something suffocating. The very air itself seemed to press against his lungs, making it harder to breathe with every passing second. The prison had a heartbeat, and it was getting louder, stronger. And then, just when he thought the pressure would crush him, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. But they weren't his own. They were too slow, too deliberate. They came from behind him, following him, their rhythm matching the pulsating hum beneath his feet. James spun around, his flashlight flickering wildly, but there was nothing there. No one. The corridor was empty. The silence in the air hung heavy, almost mocking him, daring him to move further into the abyss. And yet, despite the absence of any tangible presence, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was as though someone, or something, was standing just out of sight, lingering in the shadows, waiting for him to make a mistake. He forced himself to keep moving, his body moving of its own accord as his mind screamed for him to stop. But there was no escape. The prison had him now. It wasn't just the walls that were closing in, it was everything. The very essence of the place had become a part of him, eating away at his sanity, consuming him from the inside out. He could feel the walls pressing in on him, the air thickening with every step, the darkness growing heavier with each passing moment. Every turn he took, every step he made, only brought him deeper into its claustrophobic grip. As he walked, the prison seemed to stretch on endlessly. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on him, a relentless, crushing force that threatened to erase everything. His flashlight flickered again, and for a moment it illuminated something. Just a flash, just a brief instant. But it was enough to make his blood run cold. There, in the corner of the room, just out of sight, something moved. A shadow. But it wasn't just any shadow. It was too long, too thin, too unnatural. It twisted, shifting in ways that no human figure could. It was as though the very air had contorted itself into something grotesque, a writhing, pulsating mass of darkness that moved with purpose, with intent. James's body froze, his breath caught in his throat as he watched the shape undulate in the flickering light, each movement sending a jolt of terror down his spine. The figure shifted again, and James could have sworn he saw something human, but distorted, stretched to an impossible length. The shadow seemed to wrap around it like a cloak, like it was both a part of the darkness and a presence within it. The figure's face, James couldn't make it out. It was a blur of nothingness, a blank, empty void where eyes should have been. And then, the whispering began again, louder now, filling his mind with words that weren't words, sounds that scraped against his thoughts like nails on a chalkboard. "Come closer," it hissed, the voice seeping into his mind, burrowing itself under his skin. "We are waiting for you." The shadow moved again, faster now, a blur in the corner of his eye, but when he turned to face it, it was gone, vanished, absorbed into the very air around him. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It was suffocating now, pressing in from all sides, forcing the air from his lungs, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. And as James stood there, paralyzed, he realized with sudden clarity that the prison didn't want him to leave. It didn't care if he was scared. It didn't care if he begged for his life. The prison had already claimed him. It had always claimed him. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't distant. They were inside his mind. "You will never leave. You're one of us now." James could feel it now. The thick, suffocating grip of the prison, its tendrils reaching into every part of his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a vice. He hadn't seen the shadow again, but he could feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edges of his perception, waiting for the right moment to strike. The air had turned heavier, colder, pressing down on him with an invisible weight. The walls of the prison seemed to pulse, their ancient stones vibrating under some unseen force. The shadows that clung to the crumbling brickwork flickered with a life of their own, stretching and shifting in unnatural ways. No longer was this a place of mere confinement. It was a living, breathing entity. James's heart raced and his mind reeled as his flashlight dimmed to a sickly, jaundiced glow. Every corner of the prison felt more oppressive, more alive, as if the very atmosphere were constricting around him, eager to consume him whole. He tried to steady his breathing, to calm the adrenaline that surged through his veins, but it was impossible. There was no calm, no peace in this place. Every step forward only deepened his terror. The floor beneath his boots groaned with the weight of history, the weight of lives spent here, of souls imprisoned in unholy torment. And those souls, they were watching. He could feel their eyes upon him, their presence like a suffocating fog that clung to his skin, whispering to him, urging him forward into the heart of the prison. Then, just when he thought he couldn't take any more, the sound came. A low, drawn-out moan, soft at first, like the distant cry of an animal in pain. But the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was a voice that rose from the depths of the prison's belly, a voice that had been buried for centuries. The moaning turned to wailing, and the wailing became a shriek, a howl of such unimaginable anguish that it seemed to rip through the very fabric of reality. The walls trembled with the force of it, and James stumbled backward, his legs shaking with the intensity of his fear. His flashlight flickered violently, casting strange, elongated shadows across the stone walls. He couldn't tell where the sound was coming from anymore. It seemed to be everywhere at once, rising from the cracks in the floor, the corners of the room, the very air itself. "Leave." The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even close to being human. It was something else, something old, something that had been trapped here for centuries, festering in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to claim another soul. "You should have left when you had the chance." The words scraped against his mind, not spoken but felt, as though the very air around him were speaking to him, pressing against his consciousness, shattering his grip on reality. His vision blurred, the world around him spinning as the prison seemed to shift again, contorting itself into something worse, something even more impossible. The sound of the wailing grew louder, closer, until it was all James could hear. The walls were closing in on him now, not physically, but mentally. His mind was being crushed under the weight of the prison's agony, the overwhelming pain that radiated from every corner. He tried to move, to run, but his legs felt like lead, his body locked in place, frozen by an unseen force. He could feel the weight of something pressing against his chest, tightening around his heart like a pair of invisible hands, squeezing, choking the life out of him. The air in the room was thick with terror. Its very essence seemed to be dripping with fear, soaking into his skin, into his soul. And then, just when he thought it couldn't get worse, the shadows shifted. There was something in them, something that had been hiding, something that had been waiting for him. The air grew colder, so cold it bit into his skin, turning his breath to steam. He could see his own breath now, shallow and frantic, as though his body were desperately trying to hold on to life, to resist the inevitable. But it was too late. The shadow reached out for him, slender, long fingers made of darkness, stretching impossibly far. It was like the darkness had form, like the very air had taken shape and was now reaching for him with intent. Its fingers brushed against his arm, sending a shock of icy fear through him, a shock so intense it nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. The air was too thick, too heavy. The prison had swallowed his voice. The walls pressed in tighter, their cold stone surfaces now a suffocating weight, their very presence an oppressive force. The darkness grew closer, crawling along the floor, slithering up the walls until it was all around him. It was in the very air he breathed, in the corners of his mind, in the beat of his heart. The figure, no, the thing, in the shadows, took shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated, grotesque. Its body was a mass of shadows, a swirling void of blackness. But its face was the worst part. It was a mockery of humanity, a twisted, hollowed-out version of a person. Its eyes were empty sockets, black as pitch, and its mouth hung open in a rictus grin that stretched too wide, too unnatural. James couldn't tear his gaze away. He couldn't look away from the thing that had emerged from the darkness, the thing that had been born from the very pain and suffering of the souls trapped within these walls. He felt his legs buckle beneath him, his body unable to resist the overwhelming terror that had consumed him. His mind was spiraling into madness, the edges of reality crumbling away, as if the very fabric of existence were being torn apart around him. The thing in front of him grinned wider, its mouth opening impossibly wide as if to devour him whole. But there was something else, something worse. A voice, his own voice, sounded from within the thing's chest. "You're already one of us." It was too late to escape. He could feel the weight of the prison's curse pressing down on him, consuming him from the inside out. The walls were alive with it, the echoes of 1,000 tortured souls who had come before him, who had been swallowed by this place, who had been absorbed into its hunger. James understood now. He was never meant to leave. He had never been alive to begin with. This place, it wasn't just a prison. It was a living nightmare, a black hole for souls, a place where the very essence of suffering had gathered and festered. And as the darkness closed in around him, James understood the true horror of the prison. It was not just a place of physical confinement. It was a place where your mind was imprisoned, a place where the soul was trapped, writhing in eternal torment, forever bound to the will of the prison's hunger. And as he felt the last remnants of his sanity slip away, he realized that there would be no escape. Not for him, not for anyone. The prison had claimed him, body, mind, and soul, and he would never be alone again. If you want to hear more of these dark, twisted tales that will keep you up at night, make sure to hit that subscribe button and activate the notifications. You never know what's lurking around the corner. How long do you think it would take before you started hearing the whispers too?